Many people wonder at Joseph's apparent inner strength, with words similar to, "How could this man have got through life as he did without bitterness for those who may have caused him distress, to be in sound mind and with his gentle nature intact?" I can't, of course, know Joseph's heart, but what I do know for certain is that a great part of it was his deep, unshakable faith in God, which never left him, even I imagine in the darkest moments. His belief was a great comfort to him, especially in the final months of his life. It is hard to accept, perhaps, that Treves himself, when he first saw Joseph in the Whitechapel shop, would have no thought to consider, after seeing the most degraded and perverted version for a human being in front of him, that beneath the deformed flesh was a truly beautiful man, the owner of a stalwart heart and a gentle soul, whose faith in the Almighty would later be seen to shine from beneath that dreadful shell, like a beacon of hope and inspiration, and it would be for that time and for generations to come. It was Joseph's dear mother who, of course, instilled in him from childhood not only a love of reading, but of reading the Bible in particular. Mary Jane Merrick was a Sunday school teacher at Archdeacon Lane Baptist Church, and she saw to it that Joseph attended, just as he did weekday school. And of course it should be noted too, how she gave Joseph his middle name herself, Carey, after the leading Baptist preacher and missionary, William Carey, who had fostered the Baptist ministry in Leicester. Treves would later write of Joseph's mother scathingly, saying that she had been basically a worthless mother, who had abandoned Joseph to the workhouse. The truth was, Joseph did not speak much about himself and his family to Treves, and he would later know him as permanent resident at the London hospital. Joseph had never even told him she had died when he was about 10 years old. Treves assumed that whenever Joseph did refer to his mother, his glowing adoration of her was all fantasy, an illusion in his mind perhaps, to block out the cruel reality that she had deserted him and had never been kind to him in any way. Of course, apart from not saying about her passing, all Joseph said of his dear mother was true. He would become overwhelmed by emotion whenever he spoke of her, even moved to tears. She loved him very much. Mary Jane Merrick should be remembered as the greatest and most positive influence on Joseph's life, indeed his very character, possibly because of her own deep faith. For him she had been an angel. As I have said before, Joseph was a selfless person. When he realised he was going to be a burden on his Uncle Charles and his growing family, with whom he stayed when he ran away from his father and stepmother, it was his own decision to enter the Leicester Union Workhouse. At first, he stayed for 12 weeks, where he registered himself as church, but on his return after trying to find work without success, he later changed it to Baptist. During his time in the fairs, those who knew him, his fellow performers, would remark on his choice of conversation, which was amaze them, not in so much just because of how he looked, but perhaps just because it was out of the ordinary from the background he had been brought up in, at first the veritable slums of Leicester. It was Bertram Dooley, who was the nephew of Sam Roper's by marriage, who commented how impressed he was with Joseph's level of conversation. He expressed that Joseph was a most interesting man, who would talk about very upstage subjects, and that Joseph was a bit on the religious side too. Taking a leap through the years, we come to those last years of his life at the London hospital. Treves would comment in his writings how, apart from his time in the workhouse, which actually caused an outburst of bitter indignation whenever the subject came up, in all other things in Joseph's past he seemed to accept with a quiet resignation. That if there were any bitterness, remembering the indignities he had suffered, he gave no sign. It is to be imagined Joseph's thoughts as he would struggle each evening he could during the earlier times up the concrete steps leading from his rooms and to Bedstead Square, and then to shuffle his way slowly towards the hospital gardens. Once there, he could breathe in the fresh air, feel the grass beneath his feet, and stare up at the heavens and contemplate perhaps all that had happened to bring him to that point in time. Perhaps to thank God for the kindness of the hospital and others who had donated so much to his welfare and to his keep, all in the name of Christian charity, that singular phenomenon embedded in the very fabric of Victorian society. Sometimes, perhaps, he would let it all flow over him and just enjoy those moments of freedom and reflection. Indeed, what else could he do but be sincerely grateful, while knowing he had no longer any control over his own life. The little bit of independence he had once had was gone. He was at the mercy of others in a way, and while it was truly wonderful, the kindness and thought that had been shown to him, for myself, I would think that Joseph might have felt some glimmer of frustration about it all, while he was of course as happy as his condition allowed him to be, in his own words. And later would come visitors with gifts and further kindnesses which would be offered to him. For some, perhaps, Joseph was a noble cause to be supported, while there were more, most especially those I would like to think who actually saw him, who gave because they could see that there was a truly beautiful person in their presence and worthy of help in any way possible. He was given 3 lovely holidays in the country, and of course trips to the theatre organised by Mrs. Kendall. And there were other people too who offered him such deep consideration. Those who designed his rooms, his special chair, and Charles Taylor, the son of the engineer, played the violin to him. However, there were moments when Joseph was depressed, quite visibly so. He would tire sometimes of people looking at him, and for being left to himself for long stretches of time, which must have caused him to dwell naturally on his condition itself when he was not distracted by others. He expressed to Treves of his wish to live in a lighthouse or go to an asylum for the blind, while it is generally believed that he said the latter in the hope of a last chance to find a lady who would love him. This desire was a constant hope which he never gave up on, and Joseph most certainly deserved to be loved. During the last months of his life, Joseph was seen to be able to maintain an apparent inner calm and contentment for all he physically suffered on a daily basis. His days were punctuated by his routines of daily baths and the nurse's ministrations, and those occupations which he enjoyed, his making of the carved models, sketching, writing poetry and prose, even basket making, as well as his letters, of course. However, as time now passed, his reflections returned with a vigorous resurgence to the devotional upbringing he had received through his dear mother. He had visits from the hospital chaplain, the Reverend Tristram Valentine, who would arrange it so that he could attend chapel services on Sundays. Joseph was to sit in the vestry, where he could not be seen, but could still hear and take part in the service. He would later organise Joseph's confirmation into the Anglican communion at a private ceremony at the hospital. Another witness to Joseph's deep faith was Mr. Carl Gone himself, who on one occasion caught Joseph quietly praying to himself. I can understand Treves' comparison of Joseph's situation with that of the hero from John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, and Joseph was no doubt acquainted with the famous novel himself. He may well have associated himself, while unconsciously, with Christian, whose burden falls away at the gates of paradise. Joseph's burden being, of course, his condition and all the suffering he had endured because of it. These days, it is hard to reconcile oneself to Joseph's probable inner belief that through suffering comes salvation, but it is reasonable to suppose it might have been so. We cannot know Joseph's heart, but we can be sure that because of his deep, unshakable belief, he knew without question that he would be made straight and perfect in heaven, and he would be loved again by his dear mother. It is indeed poignant that the carved church survives. It is symbolic of Joseph's profound belief in God. Thank you for your interest.